Good evening. It's 9 p.m. here in South Korea. Thank you for joining us for our special coverage of the South Korea-Japan Summit here in Seoul. The official summit between President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has wrapped up at Yongsan Presidential Office. Now the two leaders are having dinner and a reception. To find out more, let's connect to our presidential office correspondent, Kim Do-yeon, who is standing by. So, Do-yeon, what do we know about the official dinner and the reception so far?
Jiyoung, as you mentioned, the press briefing, which was the last item for the official schedule here at Yongsan Presidential Office, wrapped up around 6:30. Now, the two went to have dinner, and that, according to the top office, started at 7:30. And for a little more detail on that, 10 of the dishes that have been announced include japchae, galbijjim, and bulgogi, some of everyone's favorite Korean food. All on the list are Korean food that would normally be presented to a guest for a special occasion. Now, alcohol is present, and the office's choice is cheongju, traditional Korean wine made from rice. Now, if you recall, the two did enjoy a long and candid interaction back in March when Yoon was in Tokyo with more than one meal and a few drinks. So, while the public is still waiting on how the dinner unfolds, it could be much longer before supper is actually wrapped up. But one thing to be aware of is that Japan was hit with a strong earthquake Friday. So this dinner could be more reserved compared to the one in Tokyo last March.
Right, Do-yeon. And now let's talk about what to expect from Kishida's schedule tomorrow. So before he leaves, he's set to meet with some business leaders and other politicians as well, right?
That's right. Prime Minister Kishida has two events tomorrow that we know of as now. First, according to local reports, Kishida is set to meet with some business organization leaders for some tea in the morning. This is reportedly hosted by the Japanese embassy here in Seoul and will be behind closed doors. We know so far that the likes of Choi Tae-won, the chairman of SK Group, will be there as he is the current chief of the Korean Chamber of Commerce. Also, according to reports, Kishida will be meeting with ranking lawmakers from the South Korean and Japanese Parliamentarians Association. From the ruling People Power Party, it will be Chung Jin-seok, and from the main opposition, the Democratic Party of Korea, it will be Yoon Ho-jung. So it is both sides of the aisle that he will be meeting. Now, that's all I got for now. Back to you, Jiyoung.
Thank you, Do-yeon, for that. That was our Kim Do-yeon at Yongsan Presidential Office. And earlier today, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida kicked off the two-day trip to South Korea by paying his respects to Korea's war veterans at Seoul National Cemetery, making him the first Japanese leader to have visited the cemetery in 12 years. Our Shin Ha-young has the details.
It was a little before noon on Sunday when Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida arrived at Seoul Airport. He was greeted by South Korea's first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Jang Ho-jin. Immediately after landing, Kishida headed to the Seoul National Cemetery and paid his respects to those who died in the Korean War and the independence fighters who resisted Japan's brutal colonization. This marks the first time in 12 years that a Japanese leader has visited the cemetery. The last visit was by former Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda in 2011. In response to a question from Yonhap News regarding the meaning of Kishida's visit to the Seoul National Cemetery, a Japanese government official said that it is natural for the leader of one country to visit a memorial site of the host country and show respect for its history. Regarding the visit, Japan's Kyodo News reported earlier that Kishida intends to show South Korea his willingness to resume so-called shuttle diplomacy. Kishida then met President Yoon in a welcoming ceremony at the Yongsan Presidential Office ahead of their bilateral summit. The summit was firstly held in a small group for about 40 minutes, followed by a discussion in an expanded format for around an hour, touching on various issues like security, high-tech industries, science and technology, as well as cooperation on youth and culture affairs. The results of the summit were announced through a joint press conference. On Monday, Kishida will hold meetings with members of the Korea-Japan Parliamentarians Union and leaders of South Korea's 6 business associations, including a chairman of the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Choi Tae-won, marking an end to his visit to Seoul. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida sought deeper ties during their face-to-face meeting, marking the resumption of reciprocal visits or so-called shuttle diplomacy between the two countries. The leaders announced the outcomes of their summit talks on Sunday, designed to take further steps to overcome bilateral disputes and strengthen their value-based partnership. We turn to our Oh Soo-young, who was there at the press conference.
The leaders of South Korea and Japan are taking the next steps to tackle major sticking points on sensitive bilateral issues as they set out to mend fences in the face of various geopolitical and economic challenges. At a joint press conference following their summit in Seoul, President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on Sunday announced key measures to build trust and value-based cooperation.
우리 두 정상은 한일 관계 개선이 양국 국민에게 큰 이익으로 돌아온다는 점을 확인하고 앞으로도 더 높은 차원으로 양국 관계를 발전시켜 나아가는 데 합의했습니다.
Building on their March summit in Tokyo, Yoon and Kishida reaffirmed their commitment to strengthening trilateral cooperation with the United States against growing nuclear and missile threats from North Korea. The leaders acknowledged their ongoing efforts to bolster security cooperation, including information sharing on North Korean missiles. Yoon and Kishida also confirmed that there have been active efforts to launch a new economic security dialogue, as well as a fund for youth exchanges, and to promote new cultural exchanges. Reflecting on the progress so far, the two leaders said they would expand programs for the future generation, including scholarships, as well as the number of flights between their cities. The two then touched upon sensitive matters, beginning with the South Korean public's concern over Japan's plan to release treated radioactive wastewater into the ocean. Yoon and Kishida agreed on a South Korean inspection into the safety of the wastewater from Fukushima, separate from the ongoing probe under the International Atomic Energy Agency. In another significant move to grow their value-based relationship, the two leaders said they would visit a memorial park in Hiroshima this month to honor Korean victims of the atomic bomb in 1945, when Yoon attends the G7 summit there later this month upon Kishida's invitation. Both leaders said they looked forward to deepening their cooperation on broader global issues at the G7 meeting. Further adding to the move for reconciliation, Kishida expressed his heartfelt sadness for Korean victims of Imperial Japan's forced labor, who he said had to work under strenuous conditions. He also expressed appreciation for Yoon's efforts to overcome the bilateral dispute on compensating the victims.
Despite the historical context of our countries, I consider it my responsibility to continue to cooperate with President Yoon and South Korea toward the future, following the steps of our ancestors who have overcome difficult situations.
Marking the first time in 12 years that a Japanese leader visits Seoul for a summit, Kishida's two-day trip has put the so-called shuttle exchange of leaders in full swing, reciprocating Yoon's visit to Tokyo in March.
It seems there is more shuttling to come as the South Korean president heads to Hiroshima in less than 2 weeks, where he is also expected to hold a three-way summit with Kishida and Joe Biden. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
All eyes were on whether Japan would issue a message of apology for colonizing Korea in the past, and if the two leaders would address the issue of Japan's plan to release radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. For an in-depth look at today's summit between Seoul and Tokyo and how it was different from the one in March, we have our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji here in the studio with us. Welcome, Eun-ji.
Good evening.
So, Eun-ji, the summit between President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida just ended a few hours ago. And back in March, when President Yoon visited Tokyo, the summit ended without Japan's apology on wartime forced labor victims and colonizing Korea. So there was some hope here in Korea that Japan would finally make a long-awaited apology. So was there any message of apology from Prime Minister Kishida?
Well, unfortunately, the message that Japan's Prime Minister Kishida gave on forced labor victims was not that much different from the one he gave in March, as he still avoided using the word apology. But for the first time, he said his heart aches for those who had to work in difficult conditions, apparently referring to Korean victims subjected to wartime forced labor. This is what he said during a joint press briefing following the summit.
Like I said when President Yoon visited Tokyo in March, our government's stance remains and will continue to remain that we uphold the historical recognition made by previous cabinets, including the joint declaration made in October 1998. My heart aches for those who had to work under difficult conditions at the time.
In March, he also said his government would continue to uphold the stance made by previous cabinets, including the joint declaration between the two countries' former leaders, made in 1998, without using the word apology. The joint statement between former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and former Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi includes Tokyo's deep remorse and heartfelt apology for causing tremendous damage and suffering to Koreans during its colonial rule.
Right. And Eun-ji, what did President Yoon say about these historical disputes?
Well, President Yoon said we need to let go of the past and that it's more important to move forward and find ways to enhance cooperation. Let's take a listen.
양국이 과거사가 완전히 정리되지 않으면 미래 협력을 위해 한 발자국도 내디딜 수 없다는 인식에서는 벗어나야 한다고 생각합니다.
Since President Yoon took office in May last year, his administration has been pushing to mend ties with Japan and has been saying that Seoul and Tokyo must leave their past behind. Seeking to improve relations, the South Korean government in March laid out plans to solve the long-standing dispute over compensation for the people subjected by Japan to forced labor, through funds secured by Korean companies instead of the accused Japanese firms. The victims and supporting civic groups protested, saying this issue cannot be resolved without sincere apologies and participation by the Japanese companies that are responsible. But President Yoon today stressed that the government is not willing to change its plan on this issue.
Right, Eun-ji, and moving on to another sensitive issue, Fukushima wastewater release. So earlier this year, Japan announced that it would discharge more than 1 million tons of wastewater from Fukushima nuclear power plant, right?
That's right. Addressing the concern, the two leaders said they have agreed to allow South Korean experts to visit Japan to conduct an on-site safety inspection on the planned release of radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Announcing the plan, President Yoon added that he hopes this becomes a meaningful step in line with many South Koreans' demands for a science-based inspection. He also noted that Kishida has vowed to work on alleviating Koreans' concerns about health and safety regarding the issue. Kishida also said Japan is aware that there are a lot of concerns in South Korea on this matter. He also stressed that as the Prime Minister of Japan, he would not let his country release water in a way that may damage South Koreans' health or the environment. His remarks come after South Korea and other neighboring countries have voiced concern, even after the International Atomic Energy Agency has said Japan's proposal is safe.
Right, and we'll have to see whether today's summit will help bolster the bilateral ties. Thank you for the wrap-up, Lindsay. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And moving on to security. Security cooperation was one of the key items on the agenda at Yoon and Kishida's summit. The leaders reaffirmed their commitment to step up security efforts between the two countries and also with the U.S. to counter North Korea's evolving threats. Choi Min-jung reports.
Cooperation on security was one of the key issues addressed by the leaders of South Korea and Japan during Sunday's summit talks in Seoul. South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida agreed that North Korea's missile threats pose serious dangers to international peace.
저와 기시다 총리는 북한의 핵과 미사일 개발이 한반도와 일본은 물론 전 세계의 평화와 안정에 중대한 위협이라는 인식을 공유하였습니다.
To address this issue, Yoon said that close communication and consultation are needed between the two sides and with the U.S. as well. The president underlined that the leaders shared the view that the upcoming G7 summit in Hiroshima later this May comes at a crucial time as trilateral cooperation between Seoul, Washington, and Japan is essential.
With North Korea's continuing provocations in the region and unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force, we once again agree on the importance of strengthening deterrence and response capabilities through security cooperation between South Korea and Japan, as well as South Korea, Japan, and the US.
Yoon and Kishida welcomed the fact that progress was made regarding the real-time sharing of North Korea's missile launches, which was agreed upon at the trilateral summit held last November in Phnom Penh. They also agreed to work closely on pursuing a strategy for a free and peaceful Indo-Pacific region. When asked whether Japan will participate in the Extended Nuclear Deterrence Initiative, dubbed the Washington Declaration, issued by Yoon and Biden during their summit last month, the South Korean president said he does not rule out Japan's future participation. On top of North Korean issues, Yoon and Kishida also agreed that South Korea and Japan should continue to work together to protect the universal values of freedom, human rights, and the rule of law shared by both countries. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
On the economic front, the two leaders have confirmed that the wheels are in motion in terms of restoring each other to their respective whitelists. They also discussed further cooperation on advanced technology. Lee Dae-yeon has the details.
The leaders of South Korea and Japan on Sunday reaffirmed that economic ties between the two countries have been re-established after first making the announcement in March following a bilateral summit. After Sunday's summit, President Yoon Suk-yeol said during a press conference that the two countries are now in the process of restoring each other as reliable trading partners. Back in March, South Korea and Japan decided to have close consultations on reinstating each other to their respective whitelist in order to normalize their relationship. Yoon and Kishida also agreed to further stabilize the semiconductor supply chain through cooperation between South Korea's chip manufacturing businesses and Japan's chip material, parts, and equipment companies. In the high-tech and science sector, President Yoon said they have discussed joint research on aerospace, quantum, AI, digital, and bio industries. President Yoon also said that he hopes that more details can be ironed out following the G7 later this month.
이번 G7 정상회의 회동을 계기로 한일 양국이 보건, 글로벌 공급망, 기후변화 등 글로벌 현안에 대한 협력을 더욱 구체화해 나갈 수 있기를 바랍니다.
Economic accomplishments were also mentioned by the Japanese Prime Minister, such as the bilateral economic meeting held earlier this month between the finance leaders from the two countries, the first time in 7 years.
During the first talks of the newly established Economic Security Council on May 3rd, two top finance officials agreed to share economic information.
The Japanese leader also expressed his appreciation for South Korea's leading efforts in hosting a trilateral summit between Seoul, Tokyo, and Beijing later this year. He also added that economic exchange programs are actively being carried out by the private sector as well. Lee Dae-yeon, Arirang News.
The leaders of South Korea and Japan also promised to bolster people-to-people exchanges, such as tourism and study opportunities, particularly with a focus on the next generation. Our culture correspondent Song Yu-jin on what we could expect.
Exchanges between the future generation are critical for deeper, friendlier ties. That's what South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol said during his joint press conference with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida after their bilateral summit on Sunday. People-to-people exchanges have been recovering fast since the two leaders held talks in March in Tokyo. Almost 2 million people from both countries have participated in some kind of South Korea-Japan intercultural exchange since then. One of the key takeaways from the Tokyo summit was the establishment of the South Korea-Japan Future Partnership Fund by the Federation of Korean Industries and the Japan Business Federation, or Keidanren. Both organizations vowed to contribute 1 billion Korean won, or around $759,000 each, to promote personal exchange, expand, and strengthen the economic relationship between Seoul and Tokyo. At Sunday's press conference, President Yoon said final stage preparations to launch the fund are underway. And Sunday's summit paved the way for the two heads of state to discuss more ways to boost people-to-people exchanges, especially between young people.
저와 기시다 총리는 한일 양국 간 인적 교류가 크게 늘어나는 추세를 감안하여 수도권뿐 아니라 지방 간 항공 노선도 코로나 이전 수준으로 회복하도록 노력해 나아가자고 하였습니다.
I shared plans with President Yoon of fully resuming our youth exchange program Genesis in full scale, increasing the number of this year's participants to 2 times of last year.
Apart from government-led efforts, Seoul and Tokyo will also work to expand people-to-people exchanges in the private sector. 송유진, Arirang News.
That is all for tonight's coverage. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with the most up-to-date news tomorrow. Have a good night.